Okay, so I'm Stucky today. All of our colleagues, for those of you that aren't that well versed with what goes on in the cybersecurity world, are all in San Francisco at the RSA conference. So those of us that are sitting here today are the ones that couldn't get funding to go to that conference because everybody else is there. But I did want to. We got the phone call from Renee a couple weeks ago that said, could you stand up and talk for 45 minutes about cybersecurity, and kind of chuckled. And as any good leader or manager would do, the first thought that came to my mind was, how can I delegate this out to a couple other people so that I don't have to bear the load by myself? But I did want to kind of start off by saying, I did want to kind of start off just talking a little bit about the Cybersecurity SIG. It's a SIG that's kind of had some ups and downs over the past few years, and I think that we're off to a very good start in the 2013-2014 season here, and we're really making a lot of strides in getting that cybersecurity SIG a little bit more operational, a little bit more functional, and a little bit more just offering a little bit more contribution to the larger ACT-IACT collaboration. We've got a great SIG leadership with Bob Post and Cheryl Soderstrom leading the way, and we've also have 8 government advisory leaders now, which is probably the strongest that group has been in a long time from the government advisory panel perspective. And we're also getting a lot of really good leadership from our priority area leads, one of which is actually sitting up here on the stage to my right, Don Johnson, who is the Director for IT Acquisition at DoD. So we had a meeting back in November in the Cybersecurity SIG, and Bob had sent out a survey to the SIG membership, basically asking what are some of the things that you're interested in. He got a fairly decent response as far as surveys are concerned, and was able to establish a pretty good prioritization of different things that we could basically tackle. We had a pretty spirited discussion in that meeting about that survey and about the priorities, and effectively what we came up with were the top 2 bullets that you see up there. The first one was actually kind of a combination of both things that were identified in the survey as well as something that came from our priority area leadership, which was how can we develop a taxonomy of cybersecurity terms that can be incorporated into acquisition documents. So obviously in the ACT-IACT world, this should strike fairly closely and to the things that everybody is working on a day-to-day basis. On the government side, it's a pretty big deal for me as a Chief Information Security Officer because inevitably what happens when I'm working on an application development project or I'm working on an IT services project or more fundamentally just any kind of project that involves the creation, manipulation, or otherwise use of government data, things will come up as some things as simple as contractors having to complete their security awareness training, some things that might be a little bit more complicated about that data, where it's stored, who owns it, how it's protected. Without better guidance provided in our acquisition documents, we have a really strong challenge as program managers making sure that the right I's are dotted and T's are crossed whenever these contracts are actually let. Added to that is the fact that in our worlds, in the IT worlds and the security office worlds, we do have challenges working with our contract officers and actually convincing them that we're relevant sometimes, just to be blunt. With the right relationships, we can make that work. With the right discussions, we can make that work. But it's not typically something that happens out of the gate. It takes a lot of discussion, and it takes a lot of collaboration with those teams. So getting involved in that discussion and helping CEOs understand what we mean with certain cybersecurity terms will kind of do a lot to get us down the path of making sure that we're writing cybersecurity requirements into contractual documents from the start. So then the other area that we talked a lot about was workforce development, so addressing training. And there's been a lot of discussion with the NICE initiative and some of the other initiatives being led out of DHS about how we can ensure that people that are coming out of school and coming out of the armed forces or other areas of government or industry being retooled as cybersecurity professionals. There's a lot of discussion about that right now, and there's going to be a lot more effort I think we're going to see around that over the next few years as we continue to try to develop and foster that workforce. But another area that I think that we have an opportunity to foster a lot of development, an area that I hope that at some point we can work very closely with Jim's effort, is the development of cybersecurity leaders. So if you're bringing all these people in and they're coming from all walks of life, how do you take the best parts of your understanding as a cybersecurity professional and mix it up a little bit with some strong leadership and develop a cybersecurity workforce that is top notch? So that's another area, another initiative that we're working pretty closely in, and an initiative that we will expect to gain steam here in the next few weeks and months, and develop some deliverables that can be useful to all. So these are two areas that if you have any interest in cybersecurity, in the Cybersecurity SIG, we've got contacts that you can touch base with. I failed to actually capture those contacts before I came up here and gave this presentation, but just want to let you know that they're out there, and you're more than welcome to send me an email if you're interested in any one of those areas. So I mentioned Don here to my right. Another area that we discussed was a priority area lead request to assist with threat information sharing standards. This is work that is an effort that is currently, I think, primarily being driven out of the C&T SIG, but there's a lot of cybersecurity implications that are included. So our hope with this, from a cybersecurity perspective, is that we'll have an opportunity to work with the C&T SIG to provide as much assistance and where necessary subject matter expertise where we can, but also from my perspective, what I'm hoping is that we'll get an opportunity to really work along with a very well-functioning SIG within ACT-IACT and learn a lot from them, about how you do things as a SIG, how you get these projects stood up and running and delivering effectively. So Don will talk about that a little bit more as our third speaker here today. So the other thing that I wanted to highlight from a cybersecurity SIG perspective is that we are continuing to try to drive more membership to our SIG meetings with what's being informally called an ongoing speaker series. So we have one coming up a week from tomorrow that I wanted to highlight, and it's basically centered around Executive Order 13636, which is entitled Improving Critical Infrastructure Cybersecurity. So just to cut to the chase, Emile Monday, I never know whether those T's are silenced or not. Monet or Monet? Monet. Okay. Emile Monday will be speaking about this executive order and a report that GSA wrote in collaboration with DoD, providing recommendations to the President addressing the feasibility, benefits, and merits of incorporating cybersecurity standards into acquisition planning and contract administration, harmonizing procurement requirements. So that again speaks to what we had said before in the first bullet. What are some of the things that we can do to help assist with that from an acquisition standpoint, and where cybersecurity is part of that effort. So here are your cybersecurity SIG and GAP leadership participants. Like I mentioned before, our chair is Bob Post, and our vice chair is Cheryl Soderstrom. Communications is headed up by Mike Agrillo at one point, and our program chair is Carrie Boyle from Grant Thornton, and we have a vacant seat in our knowledge capture. So if that's an area of interest to any of you, please don't hesitate to reach out to Bob or Cheryl and let them know that you're interested. And of course, you see the GAP leadership on the right-hand side as well. So with that said, the next presentation that I'll bring up, on January 28th, in the midst of, I believe, the polar vortex, we had a meeting at that began at dark 30 in Washington, D.C., where we had probably about 50, 60 people that came together to talk about the implications of privacy to cybersecurity. And I'm going to ask Leo to come up and provide a little bit of a recap of that discussion, and then followed by Leo will be Don. So Leo is the Deputy CISO at USDA's Food Nutrition Service, and I'll go ahead and go there. Thank you.
Afternoon, everyone. So when Brad mentioned at the beginning delegation, I'm Brad's deputy. So one of the first things he turned to me was like, well, we did this privacy forum, so I need to suck up a couple minutes, so why don't you present on the forum? So here we are, right? But I mean, quite honestly, it was a really good forum. And for those of you who don't know, it was planned like a couple months in advance, and then the whole Snowden thing broke, and then all these data privacy issues came up. So I think it was a really opportune time to come together and talk about the privacy issues that government faces as well as industry. And for those of you who don't know, January 28th is actually Data Privacy Day. So we actually managed to do it just by sheer luck to manage to have it on Data Privacy Day. So there was over 70 attendees, and about, due to all the snow and weather concerns, like Brad said, about 50 to 60 attendance. It was a good attendance, and some of the speakers are all listed there. So the keynote was Peter Miller from FTC. So basically he's the chief privacy officer there, and he basically talked about some of the challenges that government faces, and some of the things that he kind of issued out was, well, these are issues that government faces. A, how does industry come alongside? B, also, what issues does industry itself face? Because I know for industry they have their own privacy challenges as well. We wouldn't want to ignore some of the challenges and the roadblocks that they face as well. So the session was basically planned out over two tracks. So basically we had the keynote, and then we split up into two different sessions. And then the first track was basically trying to get a definition around privacy. So basically to talk about whether generationalism, I can never get that right, in terms of whether you're a millennial, whether you're part of the Gen X crowd, part of the baby boomer crowd. How do you view privacy based off that? Also regional and cultural norms in terms of, for example, we know there are stricter privacy laws over at the EU, over in Europe, versus open source data type here in the US. Regional in terms of just, even within the US, the different areas in terms of if you're in a big city and then you're in an urban area versus if you're more remote and further out. So we kind of talked about that in track one in terms of how those things play out into defining privacy, whether it's for organization, whether it's for individuals, and try to get a definition on that. So track two was talking about the technicalities about privacy. So basically privacy by design. For those of you, just by a show of hands, how many people have heard of privacy by design? So basically, a few. So basically, privacy by design is something that the Canadians come up with in terms of coming together with a common language to define privacy, right? So what are some things that we can do to get on the same page on privacy? Because as we kind of mentioned in track one, there's so many different viewpoints and different definitions of privacy. And if you're talking to someone, you want to be kind of on the same page on what you mean by privacy. And then we talked about data accountability and ownership. So basically now that we're into data sharing and coming together as a government in terms of sharing data, who owns that data? So for example, if you originally submitted data to the IRS on your tax return, and then if the government decides to do open sharing to share it to the other government agencies, what are some of the privacy concerns related to that, as well as ownership of data? If God forbid something happened to that data and there's a data breach, who's at fault and who pays for all of the legal ramifications behind that? So what we've done is you can see on the left and right we did data bubbles. So we use Yammer. So we basically use some of the associates and Voyagers to help take notes and stuff. So basically we put that into a word bubble. It's really hard to see, I'm sorry for that, in terms of some of the things that came out of it. So on the left you'll see basically the word bubble from the track one, and then on the right you'll see some of the words that came out from the track bubble from track two. So some of the things that really highlight, you can see, is just the data, the sharing, collection of data, how is it that it's managed, how is it that organizations versus individuals. So there was some really good discussions on that. And I'll just let a couple seconds here for you to take a look at the slide. So next steps. So basically what the goal of this forum was to start conversations and get people interested in talking about how cybersecurity is related to privacy. So basically how to get married up on that. So what Robert Post, the Cybersecurity SIG chair, is going to do is he's going to take these word bubbles, he's going to work with the SIG as well as the GAP to kind of follow up action items. So what they're looking for basically is anyone that's interested and anyone that wants to continue discussion on privacy, or if you're just privacy is something that you're just interested in and how it affects cybersecurity moving forward. They're definitely looking for volunteers and they're definitely looking for people to help out with that. So. And then just to plug, there's also a privacy workshop that NIST is holding in April, 9th through 10th in Gaithersburg. So if you're interested in learning more information about that, that's a great avenue to go. All right. Turn it over.
Leo, can I ask you a question?
Yes.
As Brad talked about developing a taxonomy around cybersecurity. Thanks, Renee. As Brad talked about developing first a taxonomy around cybersecurity, leading that into training, and I'm not sure, besides the cybersecurity leaders, who's the target workforce for the training? Will there be a privacy taxonomy included in that training?
That's something that can definitely be addressed in the cybersecurity. I mean, if there's interest, I mean, I can't foresee why, privacy. I mean, like I said, I think privacy and cybersecurity are pretty tied in terms of, protection of the data and then the privacy of the individual. So if there's interest and there's, I can't foresee that being an issue, right?
What I think is interesting about that is even in the information security world, I think that, it's where does security end? Where does it end, and where does privacy begin? Right.
Right.
So where I'm at, and part of what we discussed in that discussion is, as the CISO, I certainly respect privacy, but that's not what my primary job is. I've got somebody else that is the privacy officer for the agency. Some agencies it's the same person, but for me, my job is very clear. I protect the data.
Right.
Somebody else defines where that data is private and where it needs to be held to a different standard. And so whether or not that becomes part of a training curriculum, I think that's a good question. I think it just kind of depends on how the information security community decides to define its workforce.
If you don't mind, Brad, your training you're developing, is that intended for the acquisition workforce, for
So what we talked about before, to be defined. It's not. We don't have that fully fleshed out yet. Not to that level.
public and private
Public and private.
workforces?
Sure.
Okay.
Absolutely. I don't think it's not. The compliance standards are different, but when you look under the hood, the controls typically are very similar. So it can work across those different communities. It's just a matter of making sure that the standards that tie to those controls are clearly defined.
Well, eventually you're putting the burden on the federal contractors to comply with this and the federal acquisition people to monitor it,
Sure.
right?
Absolutely.
John, may I come up? Hello, everyone. My name is Don Johnson, and before we get into the heart of the presentation here, I want to talk a little bit about what we're doing, also from a priority area lead perspective for ACT-IAC. Specifically, my job in the Department of Defense is to work IT programs and also cybersecurity acquisitions. So I'm heavily involved in the policy, involved in pilots, involved in kind of where we're going with cybersecurity and DoD. The key piece of this in this type of work is that, frankly, we're in the early phases of cybersecurity, as you all know. And there's a lot of learning that we are experiencing as we go through this. For example, and also Congress is helping us, frankly. In 2010, we had Section 804 of a National Defense Authorization Act, which directed us to develop a new process, an acquisition process, completely different from how we had traditionally acquired capability, more of an iterative and agile capability based upon Defense Science Board, and that's public law. Another one was a section 933, which is develop a cyber acquisition process. So in DoD, we're very much changing our processes, but it's more than just a cybersecurity cutout that we're going to implement. It's transformational across the organization. So in spirit of that, this last year, highlighted earlier, we had an executive order on cybersecurity from the President. And in that, there was this request for GSA and DoD to develop a joint report and report back to the President. We did that. A team was formed, a report was written with recommendations back to the President. And some of them were things like common taxonomy. Some of them was changing the way we look at risk in how we implement acquisition programs. But the nutshell and overall of this report that went back is that it's going to impact the entire federal government. It's going to impact all of you, every one of you, and all your acquisitions. And in fact, the report is not just DoD and GSA. It's intended to address the entire federal base, the federal entire acquisition environments. So this report now, sent back earlier in January, if you watched the press, you had been big announcement, signed by GSA and DoD. And now the next step is we've pivoted from identifying recommendations, which, oh, by the way, in the Acquisition Excellence, a plug for Acquisition Excellence, GSA Acquisition Excellence, we're going to have a panel on this. We're going to have a panel of the three key people who were involved in writing this report back to the President. Now I'm the DoD representative on that panel as we go forward. So now I am part of this group that's now pivoted to now develop implementation of this. And some of the things, as we mentioned today, is a common taxonomy and cybersecurity across the federal government. So that when we talk cybersecurity, we have a common schema that we use in GSA and DoD and NIH and you name it, we all use a common schema against this. Section L, Section M, all the pieces of the RFP will hopefully be brought more consistently and internationally, implications associated with that. So you can hear more about that at the Acquisition Excellence Conference. There is some feedback in terms of, okay, this is great, the government's going to get together and develop an implementation plan, but what about us, industry? How do we get plugged into it? So very much so, in forums like this, and leveraging out to smart groups that we're going to talk about in just a second here, a short little vignette on some of the threat modeling that's being done. That's going to help us inform some of the things that we're looking at, like, for example, a common taxonomy. We have Jonathan Adelson, I believe, from OMG. He's going to talk about threat modeling in just a second here, which is, it's more than opinionated. Opinions of relatively smart people, maybe not so much, myself included in that last group. But it's analysis, it's detailed threat analysis, modeling, types of things, you know, the quantitative pieces of the work we do that we want to augment in having a smart approach when we look at cybersecurity instead of a bunch of opinions brought together. So with that, I'm going to ask Jonathan to come up and we can talk about that. And then I'll get if there's any other questions on where we're going to go and the cybersecurity larger priority area lead.
Thank you, Don, and thank you, Brad, for giving me the opportunity to talk to everybody tonight. This is really a work in progress about what's going on in the cybersecurity threat modeling area from the three organizations that I'll talk about that are on the cover slide here. We're working through a group that's called the Standards Coordination Council that I'll talk about in a moment, the Collaboration and Transformation SIG, and the Information Sharing Committee, which I am the chair for, and the Cybersecurity SIG, which Brad already introduced to you. The Standards Coordinating Council is a working group chartered from OMB, the way our first speaker described, and it's from the White House Interagency Policy Council, and the members are other standards development organizations like OMG and the different OASIS, the Organization for Advancement of Structured Information Standards, and then some government organizations like the NEAM and the Global Justice Information Sharing Initiative, and other organizations that are chartered in similar ways to ACT-IAC that are industry government collaborative organizations. And we get together with members of the government agencies to discuss the way that standards should be brought forward into acquisitions in order to achieve interoperability, and the way they should be monitored and checked to be sure that the implementations of those standards are actually delivering the benefits to the government agencies. So the related activities that have gone on, I want to set the context for the threat modeling activity, was the standards-based acquisition white paper that was issued by NGANAK in November of 2012. There is a current draft interoperability framework document from the program manager for the information sharing environment and the Standards Coordinating Council. NEAM version 3 has just been issued by DHS and Donna Roy's outfit, and the NEAM Uniform Modeling Language Standard from OMG. They're all coming together to describe the formal definitions of the data that could be exchanged and how they should be tagged and the mechanisms that can be used for software to exchange them safely. The current cybersecurity threat modeled work was chartered by the SEC and the Object Management Group, which some of the IAC members also belong to directly, is part of the effort, and it's a way of getting industry-driven requirements about what information can and should be shared in order to have better defenses against cyber threats. And then the government is expected to be able to adopt what the industry standards are that have already been implemented in off-the-shelf software, rather than having to say, well, because of my specific mission and my specific objective, I'm going to have different requirements. I know that's an ideal. We're very practical about that, but the whole thread of getting interoperability data exchange standards, even through NEAM, is to make it either shared missions or mission agnostic point of view about how the data should be shared. But modeling information is what the threat model is all about. It's starting with threats, but will have to do with defenses, the assets that are being protected, the actors, the protectors and the attackers. Virtually the whole life cycle of a cybersecurity environment could be the final scope of this activity. It's based on looking at existing standards, and since I know this is not predominantly a technical audience, I picked one, which is MITRE's STIX standard, which already describe indicators of an attack, the identification and description of a threat actor, either the attacker or defender, and the kill chain, the way to stop the ongoing attack from operating. And we're trying to build additional scenarios or use cases that would describe what interactions occurred during cybersecurity events, and then what data would be used to describe that, and then what data would be shared, under which circumstances, under which security protocols. So, you know, the current circumstance is that different agencies and different commercial organizations have adopted one or more of these kinds of standards in order to share data with a particular audience for cyber data. And they have to try to exchange in a many-to-many kind of environment data from STIX to the common alerting protocol, from the common alerting protocol to the intrusion detection systems that use the SNORT standard. And so each system has to deal with a standard that it uses internally and then has to translate that data to other systems that it wants to be interoperable with. So you get the number of conversions relate to n squared times the number of different standards that are being involved. The current solution being proposed is to develop yet another standard, a meta model, that would be the superset of all of the other models that are being used, and the first 5 are just examples, and we're looking to do a better survey to find more of them. And the issue is that any system using STIX, in order to communicate to a system using the CAP standard, would just have to translate to the common meta model and then have another translator to go from the common meta model back to another standard like CAP. And so the number of data conversions, instead of being multiplied by n squared, or proportional to n squared, or proportional just to the total number of standards that you have. It doesn't mean that we'd have a central system doing all the conversion, but we would provide conversion tools so that the data that is exchanged at the system interfaces would abide by the meta model that's being developed. So the major activity that we're looking for is to find more cybersecurity experts to populate the Cybersecurity SIG the way Brad Nix described, and we need volunteers to help work with the information sharing and safeguarding approaches that are being developed by PMISE. And they're attempting in this environment to be mission agnostic. Although they started out as an organization that is counterterrorism and counter weapons of mass destruction, their charter is being expanded over time to be able to deal with a diverse set of government organizations down to between the military, the intelligence community, and Health and Human Services, Department of Commerce, and other organizations. So we'd like to get that group working, and part of my role as a leader within the C&T SIG is to help make sure that the different areas of expertise represented by the existing SIGs can collaborate across these areas, and I'm privileged to represent ACT-IAC on that Standards Coordinating Council to find out what they need, bring back the needs to the organization, and work with the GAP members for all the different SIGs to make sure that we're aligned to the priority area, leaders' goals, and to match everything else. So I'd be happy to answer any questions or be a resource for you later on this evening to network. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it, Jonathan. So I do want to take a few minutes, and I'll tell you a quick story. I was talking with Jonathan and Don at the end of the week last week, and we were going over some of the material that we wanted to discuss in this meeting. And the first few cuts of the stuff that came out of this was mind blowing. I mean, it was just there was so much data and technical stuff there that I think that everybody kind of realized at first, well, this is good, but we got to kind of bring it to a level that a general audience is going to understand, and even that is difficult to do. So the point being that this is obviously a very complex issue, but when we talk about information sharing, I think that the takeaway from this is when you hear about all the challenges with information sharing in the federal government, and forget about whether it's just, whether we're talking about cybersecurity or whether we're talking about law enforcement, it's obviously, a very challenging issue. And this really does a lot to sort of highlight what those issues are. If we can't speak the same language, then how can we share anything, right? So I really appreciate the work that you guys put into kind of bringing it to a level that the rest of us could understand. But also, want to sort of finish that off by saying there's a lot of exciting stuff going on in the Cybersecurity SIG. So if you or somebody from your company or agency isn't a part of it right now, you're missing out on a lot of good stuff. So with that, I'll ask if there's any questions for our esteemed panelists here, and Renee, take it away. Thank you.
Shelton Lee, Lockheed Martin. Hi, Jonathan. I have a complex question, multiple parts.
Go slow.
Enterprise architecture. How does the cybersecurity taxonomy fit into either the DODAF or the FIA or TOGAF in terms of having a common vocabulary and architecture, along with cloud computing, and so that with those agencies moving to the cloud, to make sure that they're following a common taxonomy in order to make sure that things are consistent, and that also is transferable if they want to move from one cloud vendor to the next. So the cybersecurity taxonomy is very large undertaking, because you want to also fit into other frameworks or models because they have to work together. So I'm not sure is there a strategy on how to connect the dots to where things are seamless and not seem to be disjointed in terms of the cloud computing frameworks as the architectural frameworks I mentioned, along with following FISMA. So it's sort of a complex question.
Okay. Well, thank you, Sheldon. It's actually a good point. The two bullets that I removed in an attempt to make the presentation a little simpler were the relationship to the planning and architecture SIG and smart lean government activity that impinges on this or overlaps with this, and also to say that the folks in the DoD CIO office and the PMISE strongly recognize that architectures at the enterprise and solution level and all the levels in between are very important as long as they actually are reflected in the implementation and are not just paper tigers. And that could be a 45-minute presentation by itself, but we all certainly agree with you, and your colleague from DoD CIO, Walt Ocon, certainly believed that and was the representative from the DoD CIO office until he just recently resigned after 47 years of service, and his follow-on people are continuing in that regard. That I2F document that I cited at the beginning cites the value of enterprise architecture in this area. I just didn't include that in the major part of the presentation. But thank you for bringing up those points.
If I could just ask a follow-on to that, though, is it really necessary to tie a threat modeling and exchange structure with enterprise architecture, or are you only further complicating that model? I mean, is it better to decouple that, since really what you're talking about is a sharing of information, and by defining any kind of enterprise architecture hierarchy, I would think that you might just be complicating how that information is actually being shared. Is that?
Well, I think the jury is out on exactly how it will work. The parts of the OMG threat model include the process of sharing the data, the process of tracking an attack and a threat, and in order to know what events would trigger the sharing of which kinds of information. And as I was describing, if you get down to the nitty-gritty of an enterprise architecture, you'd at least have a systems integration model or system interface model, which would say system A is connected to system B, either between agencies or not, and would pass this kind of message about a threat in this direction. And that's what the NEAM IEPDs and data element descriptions are all about. And that's the approach that Donna Roy is taking. We do separate the need to have particular criteria for a particular architecture from the actual use of the data model. But we all feel that there's value in having some architectural information, and exactly how far we go with that is still a work in progress.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm John Dobriansky, and a lot of agencies, including mine, are moving forward for a more risk-based management approach from a programmatic perspective to cybersecurity and information assurance in general. And just wanted to hear your thoughts on that road moving forward.
So under the exec order, one of the imperatives, one of the recommendations was migrate to a risk management framework for all of the federal government. In DoD is one example, and I can maybe talk to DoD and IC. IC has migrated already in terms of they've developed a guidebook and they are migrated towards it. In DoD, we are also have migrated to an RMF framework, and we've implemented new policies, new instructions, as well as a guidebook to program managers of how to migrate from a very much a approval to an RMF-based framework. So your point is, yes, we're definitely migrating.
And speaking from our organization, I think one of the challenges to migrating to RMF framework is how do you get the business side involved, right? Because the translation between cybersecurity and business is different, right? In terms of the business risks that cybersecurity has is a lot different than what the business risks are. And then basically coming towards a common language between the two, so that way when you're explaining cybersecurity to your business executives, they understand it in terms of dollars and cents, I think.
Just to add one more aspect of it, in the cyber threat model, we are describing what the assets are, and the assets may have different value to the organization or to different types of attackers, and you have to have a different emphasis of preventive support or defense for different value of assets. If you picked the highest level of protection for everything, you wouldn't wind up being cost effective. And there are models that commercial CFOs have taken to address the difference between different kinds of data and what their exposure would be, to include the issues of privacy protection and personally identifiable information, because that's of high value to the citizens if it's a government agency that's dealing with that kind of data.
I guess this is to everybody. First of all, Don, thanks for the plug for the acquisition excellence and talking about the joint DoD GSA paper that you worked on. Don's also on our executive board, and I would suggest that's a pretty easy document to read. That if people want to get ahead of the curve, read that document, the DoD GSA Task Force recommendations, and then attend on March 20th. But I guess I have another question. As you look at sharing of information, you're developing these standards within a federal context, and cyber obviously traverses international, private sector, state, local, tribal. Have we or should we, as part of the SIG, reach out to somebody like NASCIO and to see what they're doing at the state and local level?
Well, I have a quick answer for that. Right now we're relying in large part on the IGES Institute for its contact with the state, local, territorial, and tribal levels of government, but they emphasize the Department of Justice kind of data. And we are seeking additional IAC members for these working groups and SIGs, but also our government counterparts. And when we can get state, local, and territorial governments to be represented, we'd be certainly more than happy to have them involved.
I would just suggest, Don, I mean, IGES is really focused on the law enforcement community, and if just to suggest, we might want to reach out to the National Association of State CIOs and see if they want to supply some volunteers to help here too.
Yes, we're having at the another event. If you'd like to attend lots of different events, is the Standards Coordinating Council is holding an event inside the OMG technical meeting that will be here in Reston, Virginia on the last week of March. And on March 27th, they're having the 3rd annual Wis Conference, which stands for the Workshop on Information Sharing Safeguarding Standards. And I'm a panel moderator, and the people we're getting for that panel are from GSA, NASCIO, and one other big organization. So we've gone out to NASCIO to find out what their constituents are having, and we're using their technical staff members to represent in a small forum the multiple points of view of different state CIOs. PMISE is actively involved with the New Jersey information sharing environment, and the New Jersey State CIO is very involved with it, and we're trying to tap into the experiences that they've had that have been very positive too.
Hey, hi, I'm Jonathan Hyde, Stan NGANAK, peeking around the corner here. So first of all, I want to thank you for your leadership in stepping up to spearhead this initiative. This all came out of a process that started in many ways when Shmendra Paul addressed the Executive Advisory Council for ACT-IAC, and then followed that up with a request for ACT-IAC to sort of take a leadership role on this, and Jonathan stepped forward and took the reins of this on behalf of the organization, and clearly that was the right choice given your excellent remarks tonight. Do you see any change in vector of the OMG effort given the cybersecurity framework release? Is that affecting the work in terms of the large momentum that's got, or is it kind of moving along on a parallel track and they'll join up at some point?
Well, from my view in the trenches, I can tell you that the new government, the new presidential proclamations and executive orders help a lot. The other white papers that have been submitted in response to that are very helpful. And Shmendra Paul at the PMISE and Mike Howell, who's active as a GAP member for a couple of different SIGs, is really driving home exactly what they need in order to get support. And it's a work in progress. We're in the formative stages, and I would imagine in a matter of weeks we'll have a clearer point of view of exactly how we can help, and we're trying to formulate that right now. Thanks, Dan.
I think we've exhausted these gentlemen enough. Let's give a round of applause to them.